It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Chuck Kovacic, who is a highly regarded and well-known artist and master restorer. Many of you have been the beneficiaries of his restoration work, and it is amazing. Uh, but he's going to talk today about present a seminar called Up in Smoke. He's going to be talking about cigar labels and other kinds of labels. If I think we're running short on time, we're over on time. So if you have any questions, what I'd like you to do is to send them to me via chat, and I will present these to him afterwards, and he will write answers that we will have in the next issue of the Checkerboard that we will have along with a video of his presentation. Okay, so just send your questions to me and you'll see the answers later on. Chuck, it's a pleasure to turn it over to you at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much for coordinating all this wonderful programming via Zoom. And it's such a delight to see some of the fellow members of the Quad A that I haven't seen for a while. So thank you for allowing me to talk about something that is truly ephemeral, because I've titled it Up in Smoke. And one of the very, very first things that I started collecting a lifetime ago were cigar box labels. And part of the appeal of the cigar box labels to me at the time, I was in college and really couldn't afford some of the nicer pieces, that so many of the cigar box labels were those signs in miniature. And the printing was phenomenal, as we saw in the earlier presentation of some wonderful little advertising pieces, print pieces. You can see the color and the detail that were being produced. And I'd like to recommend to the members a wonderful, wonderful book. It's sometimes difficult to find. It's called Color Explosion by Jay Last. And a couple of years ago, Jay produced this in connection with the Huntington Museum out here in Pasadena, California. He donated his cigar box label and canning label collection to the Huntington Museum. And this, although it wasn't a straightforward catalog, it does list all the early lithography companies and the producers of so many of the things that we collect. So it's worth finding. Again, it's called Color Explosion by Jay Last. I do believe that copies are available at the Huntington Museum, but you might be able to find it on Amazon or eBay. So Up in Smoke, I'm going to be focusing on cigar box labels. Time, alas, does not permit to go into detail about canning labels and some other related pieces, but the connection here is that all these labels were produced by many of the same manufacturers, and they were using the same printing techniques. So I wanted to share some information that I've gathered over the years about some of those early techniques and why these earlier labels are just so bright and beautiful and wonderful. Next image, please, Paul. Hurrah! We're all here, virtually and otherwise. This is an example of an early label, and many of the labels that I'm going to be sharing with you today, you'll see information at the base of it. It'll have the name of the printer, the name of the distributor, and interestingly, the prices for the labels. You could buy as many as 100 of them for like $10, $20. And one of the things that I'll be talking about is that it's quite possible you could find the same label, but using different names. So let's begin exploring the world of Up in Smoke through cigar box labels. Next image, please. Now then, I was so lucky that when I was at the Art Institute in Cleveland, I majored in graphic design with a minor in photography and painting. And upon graduation, I started working with a advertising agency as an art director. And one of the firms that would regularly send salespeople over to us was the old Central Litho Company of Cleveland, Ohio. And at the Central Litho Company, they were responsible for many cigar box labels and early posters and prints. And the Midwest was just a focal point for the printing industry. You had firms in Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, as well as New York. Now, it all begins with a piece of original art. The art for our cigar box labels were produced to size. And often there was a situation where an artist would be commissioned to turn in a much larger piece. And you see these fellows down here reducing it to a smaller size. Now, they didn't have a way necessarily photography wise or mechanically wise to do these early on. So they had to do it by hand. So these fellows here are diligently reducing in size these larger images to fit the format of the cigar box labels. Next image, please. Now, one of the fellows that I spoke to, and this was about, good heavens, 73, 74, I'm really showing my age today, was a gentleman at the Central Litho. He was in his 90s at that time. And he started telling me how so many of these early works were produced on lithographic stones. Now, these stones you may occasionally have found at flea markets. They have a reverse image. It's a black outline of an image on a heavy, heavy stone. Imagine a stone 2 or 3 times the size of a phone book and something that thick. It used to take 2 or 3 pressmen to cart these stones around. But what is of interest here is notice how closely this fellow is working. And my contact was relating to me stories of his youth when he was starting out in his late teens and 20s. And he would labor all day transferring images to the litho stones. Now, of course, the lithography process is known to most of us. It has that wonderful scattered dot pattern that the colors are thereby allowed to mix and mingle on the final printed piece. What many of us might not know is that there might be as many as a dozen different colors that would go into the production of each of the pieces that we so desire and collect. Each one of those stones then had to be carefully registered. But that stippling technique that I mentioned, you see a fellow here that is cleaning up an image. It's not on a litho stone, but the process of concentration is very much the same. And this gentleman related to me that you'd work all day carefully transferring and stippling an image only to have a single hair descend to that stone. And of course, all the gentlemen of the period had their hair carefully coiffed and oiled, and there'd be just enough oil in that single strand of hair. It would totally obliterate and destroy the stone because that oil would seep out to the rest of the image. They'd have to burnish it off and start again. So this is a very painstaking, labor-intensive process, which is why these images are so beautiful and wonderful. Next image, please. So, as a restoration person, I get a number of images such as this. And they say to me, Chuck, can you remove all these scribblings and all these notes? And my response is always the same. Yes, I could, but I will not. And the reason for that is this is a printer's proof. And there's a lot of very important information whenever you find a proof like this. Beginning with, look at that column on the left-hand side. Now, each of these press people had to sign off on the different colors that were used. And as you can see here, each line of copy represents a different color. That means there were that many different stones used in the production of this single label. You'll note also the initials at the bottom left-hand corner. Those are the initials of the pressman, the foreman that has signed off on the piece. You'll see other additional notes, including the date of February 15th, 1912. The stone lithography process really lasted into the early 20s, but what accelerated its demise was the cheaper offset printing process that became more popular and just frankly cheaper and easier to use during the First World War. But of other note here is Silver Club. Silver Club. Well, notice the use of silver in the image. Silver ink was one of the rarest and most volatile of inks to use. It was a powdering process, and quite often that powder would linger in the air, and it was highly explosive. Just a single little spark or a bit of static could set it off, and it would explode. Therefore, you very rarely see the use of silver ink. Next image, please. There you go. Now, I mentioned the different stones. These would be printed out individually on a series of sheets. They were referred to as progressives because you would check, the press people would check the proper registration of these images so that collectively they would create that multicolored finish image that was required during the process. The shorthand for this, they're called progs, but they're also referred to as progressives or proofs. And again, you'll see in the corner along the bottom of these, you'll see like a little bar. It looks like a smear of color. That is a proof mark of the press person for each color generation that allows them to double check whether or not they've got the proper intensity of color. They could cut back on the amount of ink used. They could change the color, but it's a quick notation reference as the piece was in actual production. Next image, please. Here you can see those color bars, and you can get an idea of just how many colors would be used in a production of one of these cigar box labels. And again, I hasten to add, this is also the same process that were used for the lithographic canning labels, the posters, the prints, the point of purchase displays that we also love and admire. You'll also see on the left and the right, and the top and the bottom, the registration marks. Now, if you were to look at one of these proofs under a magnifying glass, you'd see they all perfectly aligned, but you'd see ever so faintly these different colors. Well, imagine coordinating perfect registration of 10 or 12 colors. It's a mind-bogglingly complex process. I can well see where manufacturers and printers were relieved to have a cheaper and easier offset and photographic process for printing. John Drew, by the way, is the great-grandfather of Drew Barrymore, hence her name, Drew. She was named for her great-grandfather. Next image, please. Next comes the embossing of these labels. As we are well aware, there were different embossing techniques used on these labels. There were two embossing plates that could be used, a male and a female embossing die would be made. One would be concave, one would be convex. These are pretty difficult to find. They were done on heavy brass. Likely they were discarded over the years as printers would consolidate and clean up their various warehouses, not to mention scrap drives during the First and Second World War. So to find one is somewhat rare. The paper would be pressed into this, creating the embossing. But now you've seen the challenge of coordinating and properly aligning those different colors. Now imagine compounding it further with this embossing. And there might be as many as 2 embossing dies. Next. The presses were quite large. They'd fill entire rooms, entire floors of these businesses. You see a standard press of the era here, and you can see all the different images that are on the sheets of paper. They were constantly being checked for alignment, that the proper amount of ink, the proper colors were being used. It was really, really an interesting concentration of labor and disciplines. And I was ever so lucky to visit press rooms early on in the 70s while a lot of these presses were still in use. Of course, they've all been replaced now with high-speed offset printers. Next image, please. Now, once these images were printed, they would be gathered in salesman sample books. And here's a nice selection. These sample books would be taken to end users to show the different labels, the different titles. And one of the appeals to me as a collector is that cigar box labels really, more than most other collectible, really chronicle the development of this country economically, socially, entertainment, political, patriotic, scatological, artistic. There are so many different categories chronicling different developments and events that were happening in the country. The Library of Congress lists over 80,000 registered titles from the period. But I think that's an undercount, as I'll be discussing momentarily. But these salesman sample books do turn up periodically. And one of the more prominent companies was the George Schlegel Company of New York. And for collectors, they are the creme de creme of the cigar box label collecting world. Next image, please. So who did these cigar box label manufacturers call upon? Well, little cigar factories such as this. Little mom and pop operations or larger operations were scattered all across the country. If you had a community of any size, you might have 2 or 3 little shops like this. And the people would gather to roll the cigars and then distribute them. But an interesting thing began to happen in the 1880s. In order to regulate the distribution of these cigars and their sizes, the government stepped in and said, okay, kids, you have to start selling these and distributing these cigars in cans and boxes. It's a way of regulating it, shipping it, and displaying it. And that led to the standardization of the various cigar sizes. So the salespeople would show up at a shop like this, and as the cigars were assembled and the boxes were assembled, these same crews would affix the labels. Next image, please. This is a quick little drawing from one of the cigar box label books, information books that I have. I've collected about a dozen such books over the years. And this demonstrates the number of labels that could potentially be available for a cigar like Hurrah or John Drew. All the different labels that could be affixed to a box. So potentially it's difficult enough to find one or two. It's very rare to find a complete set. Next image, please. General Amante. I have no idea who General Amante is. There were cigars produced for all sorts of personalities. I have a friend that is a historian. He researches Mexican military activities. He has found no mention of a General Amante. But I show the image here because it was one of the very first cigar labels I ever collected, that I ever found. And a lifetime ago, I had a small antique shop, and I would carefully mat and frame these images, put them on the wall. I could never sell them. An endless parade of customers came in and said, "These aren't real. These are fake. They're reproductions. They're in too good a shape." I said, "Well, they were found in warehouses that were being torn down. They're mint." "No, something that old couldn't have survived. It's in too good of shape. It's mint. It's a reproduction." Well, I got so tired of these conversations, I gave one of these General Amante labels to my salesman friends at Central Litho, and I said, "I want you to reproduce this label." And they said, "Chuck, are you out of your mind? This is real gold leaf that was applied to the label. We can't apply gold leaf anymore." And I said, "Fine, do what you can." "Chuck, this is a female and male embossing process. Do you know how expensive that's going to be?" "I don't care." "Chuck, do you realize that the paper that these labels are printed on, it's a clay coated stock? There's actually a thin layer of clay that's applied to the paper. That's why the colors are so bright and vibrant and why the embossing is so sharp. We can't get that paper anymore. It's not available." "All right, give me the highest end proof paper you've got." "Chuck, there's about 10 different colors here. Do you realize how expensive that's going to be to reproduce?" "I don't care. I want 500 of them." So I waited. And the next time somebody came into my shop and said, "These are reproductions. These aren't real," I pulled out that printer's estimate and I said, "Well, I'll sell you a reproduction at my cost. It'll cost you $48. That's my cost for a reproduction. However, if you want to buy an original, matted and framed for $10, you can have the original." I imagine so many of us have had similar conversations over the years. Next image, please. Hans Wagner is generally considered, this particular cigar box label is generally considered the single most valuable cigar box label. I had a friend acquaintance years ago that used to attend shows, and he would bring this and he would tout it as the world's rarest, most expensive cigar box label. He wanted $25,000 for this particular label. And of course, its value was the fact that it was Honus Wagner, who was famous or infamous for discouraging tobacco companies from using his image. And there were multiple lawsuits, and the company here tried to get away and around this by calling their cigar Hans Wagner. It didn't work. The proofs were destroyed, and there's only about a dozen or so of this particular label that are known. It's from the Schlegel Company out of New York, which I previously mentioned. Next image, please. So these images go back quite a ways. This is one of the earliest that I have. It dates from the late 1870s, early 1880s. And as you can see, they really didn't have multicolor printing available for quantity printing. This is an inner label. It would have gone on the inside of the box. And again, potentially there would have been 7 other accompanying labels to go with this particular one. But again, it highlights what I touched on earlier. The subject matter is so vast, and some of the most beautiful and interesting ones are of a patriotic nature. Next image, please. Of course, one of the fun things is finding related signs that would go with these labels and the boxes. I have seen one of the original boxes, and years ago I saw a fabulous multicolor metal embossed sign featuring pennyweight cigars. So often the end user, the client, after commissioning the artwork, would use that same artwork for multiple purposes. Next image, please. Of course, the patriotic nature, and this is kind of a crossover piece because you see a photo lithograph that is now being used. And of course, this dates from the Spanish-American War. And notice the tears at the left-hand margin. This is an indication that this came out of a sample book, of course. And the samples, you would go in to that little cigar shop that I showed earlier, and you'd sit down and you'd say, how would you like to buy 100 of number 236? And you could order them in as few a quantity as 100 inner labels, of which this is one, and an outer label that would be affixed to the outside of the box, and you could get them for $1.50. Next image, please. Now, one of the fun samples that would generally be printed is you'd have all that information for pricing, and not wanting to let the margins go to waste, you would also imprint the matching cigar band, so that as the salespeople would go out on their rounds, they'd say, hey, by the way, don't you want those matching cigar bands to go with Big Sam? This dates to around the First World War, and it wasn't uncommon that these labels, to keep the price as it was, there'd be multiple printings. They'd use the same artwork over and over again. So it's not uncommon to find a label that it had been designed, say, in the early 1900s, and it would be used through the 30s and early 40s because they would still have quantities of that label in the warehouse. And often they would imprint in one of the corners an updated price. Next image, please. Dave Kinney. As I mentioned, they would have some of the most obscure people that they were honoring. Who was Dave Kinney? Why, of course, he was the last survivor of the Boston Tea Party. Who wouldn't want to smoke a Dave Kinney cigar? And again, there were over 80,000 titles that the Library of Congress registered. And here you see the wonderful cigar band accompanying it. Next image, please. Now, you get a particularly popular person, such as Joe Cannon. Who is Joe Cannon? Well, he was a long-serving Speaker of the House in the late the Civil War, and hence you see multiple uses of his image. The earliest one being on the right, Captain Joe. This is one of the outer labels that we have mentioned here as being available that would go on the end of the box. And inside, you see 2 other versions of the label. one dating from around the First World War and a second one that would have been produced in the 20s. And of course, emblazoned with Joe Cannon's signature. Next image, please. There you go. This is one of the more complete sets that I've been able to acquire. American Protectorate. Of course, it is President James Monroe. Protectorate referring to the Monroe Doctrine. And if you remember your civics and history lessons, this was quite an important document. But our interest here is you have the large inner label, the square outer label. You have the oval label that would be used to seal the outside of the box. You have a little inner flap label, that unusual little shape in the lower right-hand corner. And then you have the end edging labels. Now, all these had to be applied by hand on these boxes by the men and women in that earlier photograph that would have to be carefully glued to each box. Very labor intensive. Next image, please. Now, as I mentioned, the Library of Congress registers over 80,000 titles. But I also touched on the fact that the salesmen, as they'd take the salesman sample books around to the end users, they'd say, how would you like to order cadetship? And maybe one of those end users would say, you know, I love this image, but my daughter-in-law was a band major in the local parades here, and I want a label featuring her. We always nicknamed her Parthenia, so I want to order a label of her. So you have all these other variants that would start popping up. Next image, please. And incidentally, I touch on the gold on these labels. As you can imagine, walking into a cigar store or counter of the period, the light flickering across these labels, that gold is perfectly registered with the embossing that was used. So the light would flicker across these wonderful images. And here's one you see of the Wiedemann Company of Cleveland, Ohio, which is my old hometown. And at the bottom, you see its first major building. And up above it, in celebration of one of its anniversaries, it has a more elaborate image that also features the statue of Oliver Hazard Perry. Why? The end user wanted it, and he got it. Next image, please. There were these wonderful, wonderful labels that the salesman would bring them around. There'd be nothing imprinted on it. So you'd have this little mortised box, as you see here. Smoke the celebrated Quad A cigars. You could have whatever name you wanted imprinted in there. And it was yet another opportunity to customize your particular cigar box and cigar label offering. Next image, please. Now, one of the joys of these is you'll find labels that have just so much wonderful information and the detail that is involved. And what's fun here is if you go to the next image, look at the detail that's held on this. You get this wonderful cigar case with the boxes and the cigar lighter, and you get to see the detailing of that embossing. And I'd also like to point out that that little cigar box and cigar lighter, they're embossed as well. So all this, I believe, was ultimately designed just to catch the eye of the end user and to catch the light as it would play across the counters and the display cases. They're really totally unique and beautiful pieces of art. Next image, please. Now, back in the late 80s, early 90s, cigar box labels as a collectible began to really take off. There were a number of collectors that had been involved with collecting stock certificates, coins, stamps. Everybody had been burned at that point by collecting Beanie Babies and uh, gold coins and the mystery of grading and why one would be worth more than the other. And a number of collectors, dealers got together, Sid Emerson, Cy Bass, Bob Sechrist, got together and started promoting cigar box labels. And it was the beginning of the first heyday for collectors. And you can begin to see why people who collected currency and stamps might gravitate towards something like this. These were rare images. They weren't necessarily available in large quantities. And look at the printing of that. It could very well be a banknote. Next image, please. Look at the way the gold plays across the gold. A lot of the coin dealers became enamored of the use of the coinage, of the business-related images. And the prices for the labels very quickly started skyrocketing. It became attuned to tulip mania in the 17th century, where suddenly images such as this that one could acquire for $10 or $15 were now going for hundreds. It was beginning to get a little bit out of hand. Next image, please. People, again, would begin to collect specific labels related to mining, prospecting, Wild West images, images of beautiful women. And if you went down to Mr. Bass's and Mr. Emerson's coin dealer shop, their entire second floor in Oceanside, California, was devoted completely to cigar box labels, carefully arranged by category and graded. The mania got to be such that they started cataloging as many images as they could, assigning them grades, much in the manner that they had with stamps, currency, and coinage. And again, the prices began to skyrocket. Next image, please. Sir Joshua Reynolds, who doesn't want to promote a fine artist, as promoted here. Next image, please. Again, anti-monopoly. Who wouldn't want to be anti-monopoly today? It might be a worthwhile cigar, but this image is important, I think, from the printing standpoint, is that it is one of the earliest multicolor lithography images that I have found. It dates from the early 1880s. Next image, please. Of course, you'd want to highlight the most popular automobile of the day. I have a selection of automobile-related cigar box labels, and I have people pore over them, desperately trying to figure out what particular automobile this is. It's kind of has a measure of crossover appeal in that. And again, look at all the wonderful pricing for the different labels and the quantities. Next image, please. Of course, highlighting entertainers, popular culture of the period. You see an array of stage personalities here. Next image, please. Edwin Booth, of course, would merit his own label. And again, the wonderful printing notations in the lower and upper right-hand corners here. Next image, please. Ethel Barrymore, again, two early versions. One early on in her career, an outer label to the right, an inner label to the left. And again, those wonderful, wonderful notations. The earlier one dating to, I believe, 1900. Next image, please. Matinee Star. Who wouldn't want to smoke a Matinee Star? The perfect cigar to light up. But look at the wonderful color registration. Now, years ago, I got to visit the the Library of Congress to look at their collection. So imagine my disappointment when, after spending about a half an hour going through their collection, I said, well, I'm ready to look at more. And they said, Chuck, you've looked at the entire collection. I said, you only have about 400 pieces? Well, as so has often happened, the Library of Congress and many museums began de-acquiring so many of these images in the 70s and 80s. They just ran out of storage space. There was no need to keep them in copyright anymore. They had fallen out of copyright. So they began de-acquiring them. So where's the rest of that collection? I have about 1,200 pieces in my collection, and that's considered a small collection for cigar box labels. I've dealt with dealers and collectors that have as many as 5,000 and 6,000 different labels. Next image, please. Tom Rush, sports related. Tom Rush, a hero of dime novels. And you could toast your favorite Ivy League school by smoking a Tom Rush. Next image, please. And who wouldn't want to honor your poultry stock? Oh, there's got to be dozens of people in the Midwest wanting to do so by smoking their prize stock cigar. Look at that rooster. Look at that cheroot. Next image, please. Or papoose. Here's a gentleman that in his anxiousness to use every bit of the margins of the label, he printed everything in there, touting how wonderful the cigars were, leaving no doubt as to what his name was. And of course, they are mild and they have quality. Next image, please. Tabby, this is one of my absolute favorite images. I have, as I'm sure many of you do, you have people with particular interests. I have a number of collectors that collect nothing but cat-related items that keep telling me, Chuck, if you ever sell your tabby, let me know. And I said, well, I don't have a tabby, but I am looking for a Maine Coon. Next image, please. Puritan. Can you imagine smoking a Puritan cigar? Puritans didn't believe in enjoying much of anything, let alone a cigar. Next image, please. King's Gesture, probably one of my more favorites. But look at the Shakespearean quote in the lower left-hand corner. The distributor on the other side, and the prices, and I hasten to add, it was also available in a blank version, so you could imprint whatever you wanted on it. Next image, please. Now, so many of us believe that at some point in our distant past, there was a single image, a single item that we purchased that led to our mania. And for me, on a rainy day in 1970 at the Great Geauga County Flea Market in Burton, Ohio, I wandered in to one of the fairground buildings and I found 3 of these. This is the first cigar box label I ever purchased. And she is dearest to me. I have no idea who she is, but interestingly, years later, my lovely and beautiful wife has curly blonde hair. Was this somehow imprinted early on? I don't know, but it remains ever more so my favorite and most valued cigar box label. And I believe that's the last of our images. And I would be pleased to answer any questions that you might have.
Again, if you would pass your questions along to me through the chat function. We are behind time, although I want to recognize, Chuck, you did it in exactly 45 minutes, the time we were allotted. On the nose. Congratulations. But please get your questions to me. I'll refer them to him, and he will answer them, and we'll have them in the next issue of the Checkerboard. Chuck, I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation, for sharing this gorgeous lithography and the wonderful stories that go along with them. You are a cornucopia of knowledge. I'm just so impressed. So thank you very much.
You are more than welcome, Paul. And thank you to all of the wonderful Quad A members that are checking in. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully at the next convention as things begin to open again. Bye, everyone. It's been a delight.
Thank you. Steve.